here's a hot take. This 5v5 change will lessen the overall cost of running an owl team. Okay, that sentence isn't well formulated, but I understand the point. This 5v5 change will reduce the overall cost of running an Overwatch League team. Could that have been a factor in this decision? I will say absolutely categorically no, that will not have been even a consideration in this decision. Overwatch League is such a tiny, tiny, tiny proportion of the Overwatch ecosystem as a whole. The money it generates, I mean, even in terms of the revenue even in terms of the expense to keep those players on, those are team expenses, and the teams do not have that kind of say in what's going on. In fact, I would imagine the teams did not even know that this was happening until very recently. I would say, if I had to guess, I would say the Overwatch League teams didn't even know the game was going 5v5 until sometime this week, because otherwise there would have been leaks. 100%. Now, whether or not that's a good thing, right, of whether the pros were asked about this kind of thing or whether the pro scene had any kind of input on the decision is a separate question, right? Like, who was it? I think it was FRD that was tweeting saying that disrespectful or something to not consult the pros in this decision. I can understand that point of view, but I don't think that it's reasonable because, again, tiny, tiny part of the ecosystem, and pro players are always just going to say no to a change like this because it impacts their bottom line. So
Sideshow
it's not reasonable to have. By the way, the rumors of the 5v5 stuff were not based on people leaking shit. They were just based on people noticing in the gameplay trailers that nobody had seen two tanks be run at the same time. And because it was something that Jeff had said in a prior interview that they were like thinking about, and something that they had tried on the experimental card way back, I think, because of some Seagull shit. So that's where that kind of stuff came from. Another hot take. They tried to make Overwatch a casual game and kill pro play. First of all, you always have to prioritize the casual point of view. There's got to be some kind of balancing act for sure. But if you did make a very big casual game and completely kill the professional scene, I agree, that would be a bad thing for the game as we love it, as esports fans, as hardcore fans of the game. Is this going to kill the game professionally? No. Is it going to massively change it? Yes. Do we know whether it's going to get better or worse at this point, having not tried it out? I don't think so. There will be some aspects that people will really miss. The tank synergy at the front line, the way that you coordinate with those two, the legacy of incredible tank duos. People are going to miss that. It's going to be a real, point of nostalgia for everybody who watches Overwatch in the future. But there is also a potential for the game to get better from a professional point of view as well, with the game potentially opening up or having more individuality at play. It's going to be different, though. It definitely is. But I don't think at this point it's clear whether it's going to be better or worse, or whether it's just going to be different. But I do think there's no chance that it actually kills the pro play. Like, there's just no world in which that happens. Unless they decide to pull the plug with the Overwatch League at the same time as releasing Overwatch 2, which I don't know why they would do that. There's no logical reason why they would. But unless that literally happened, they're not going to kill pro play just by making design decisions like this. Let's move on. Charles Serial, thank you for the 15 months. I just walked in on 5v5. My worst nightmare. Wait a second. Where did that go? My worst nightmare is becoming reality. Yeah, a lot of people were not into this at all. I'm keeping an open mind. My initial gut reaction was, oh God, this is an enormous change. And it changes the core gameplay so much that I think a lot of people who've fallen in love with 6v6 might get turned off by this. Because if the game changes massively, you're moving away from what people enjoyed when they fell in love with it, right? Like, you've built this huge audience, and it is still a huge game, Overwatch, if we're comparing it. It's not the biggest game in the world, but it's still huge. It has large monthly active users. You're taking all of those people and you're appealing to other people rather than your core audience. So that's good in a sense that it could really grow, as long as you don't cause the core audience to dislike the product. I don't think a large amount of the core audience will dislike 5v5. If I'm thinking about the concerns that Overwatch DPS players have been making for years, I feel like DPS players are going to fucking love this. Support players depends on how much they get bullied. Because I can imagine a world in which it's brutal to play support in 5v5. But if they buff the shit out of the supports, then I think you can, in a 5v5 world, make the supports much more powerful. Because you only have one main tank that you have to focus on dealing with. So keeping him alive all the time with healing is not as bad, because you can try and dive the backline. There's no peels. Like, you can try and attack the supports directly. So I think that you can make the supports much better than they are in the current base game right now, which could feel fun. It's possible with a smaller roster size. I think it's easier to make individual heroes overpowered without making the game broken. But that might not end up working out. It's very difficult to tell. Another hot take. If tank becomes an even more stressful role than it already is, I don't see queue times improving that much or at all. Well, that's just simply not true. Let's analyze that genuinely. People would have to become 100% less likely, or rather 50% less likely, to play tank in order for the queue times to not be affected by going 5v5. Like, you would have to take all of the tank players, and a full half of them would have to decide, like, we're talking millions of people would have to decide, I'm not playing tank anymore at all. There's just no way. There's simply no chance. If you think that's a possibility, I think it's simply because your head can't conceive of the numbers of people that would have to coordinatedly make that decision. You couldn't. There's no way. There's no way. Also, we're saying that without realizing what the tanks look like or feel like. It might be more fun to play tank right now. It might be more fun to play tank in 5v5 if they nerf the crap out of CC than it is currently. I think that will be the case for some of the tanks. I don't think it'll be the case for all of them, though. But I think it'll make it more fun to play some of the tanks. But yeah, I don't think that's even possible that queue times would not be improved by this. It's such a drastic change that queue times will necessarily be improved. It would have to, I mean, the playing habits, which at this point are ingrained and have been developed for years, would have to be flipped on their head. And I think there'll be some sizable change, but it's not going to be an enormous change like that compared to the literally removing one tank from the game. Another hot take. I'm not sure that pro off tanks will lose their jobs. There will be the same amount, possibly more, tanks in the game. It's possible that the one tank player can't play all of them to the OWL level. There will just be more substitutions between maps in the tank role. Yes, I agree with that. I think that's a really important point, Blue Box. Yep. There definitely will be more tanks in the game, because they're going to be committing to releasing more heroes, and those can't all be DPS or support. Million Ants, thanks for the 7 months as well. As a Rein main, I am incredibly excited. Less right-clicking, more holding W. Yeah, that does seem to be the way in which they're going for the tanks, that they're more offensive threats that you have to deal with. Not necessarily offensive in terms of dealing a shit ton of damage, but they're going to be able to stay alive longer whilst dealing damage, rather than just being shield bots or having to hide or whatever, stuff like that. So I think that's going to make some difference. But having said that, they would have to balance the main tanks very effectively for that, because they no longer have their off tank to be able to give them bubbles, give them defense matrix, that kind of stuff. So it all just comes down to the balance of how they tackle that, right? Of like, do they take reduced damage? Do they have way more armor? Does the fact that you're playing with two supports who are only pocketing the main tank make a big difference? It's down to balance at that point, and whether or not you trust that they're going to be able to make it work. And I know that people are going to say, well, yeah, I don't trust the dev team. They haven't been able to make Overwatch 1 work. But that's what you're choosing between is, or not choosing between, but that's what the theoretical worlds are between, is like, can they fix this version of Overwatch, or can they fix that version of Overwatch more easily? Which I don't know what the answer is. But I think 5v5 inherently has less variables, so it should be easier to balance. They're also introducing more core concepts like passives and stuff that those provide more variables per role that they can tweak. So removing role lock will make 5v5 better? I don't think so. In the current iteration, it seems like DPS would just be insane. Goats version 2, 2 tank, 3 supports. Yeah, maybe. I mean, yeah, if they buff the shit out of tanks, then yeah, removing Roadhog would just create a nightmare scenarios with double tank. Or maybe even triple tank if the healing was good enough. Okay, what else did we have here as well? Furious Yammer with 300 bits. I think my overall take on this is what the devs said. They want to take the game back to its core shooter roots. I can see that, and it's a great thing for some people, but it's not why I started playing Overwatch and why I love the game. Yeah, and I think that is a really... that's a very interesting thing, is that a lot of the vocal people that disliked Overwatch or have grown to dislike it over time, the people who moved away from Overwatch... A lot of them were annoyed at CC, DPS not having as much impact as it previously did, the game being more of a MOBA and less of its shooter roots. And so it feels like these changes are designed to try and recapture that group of players that did like Overwatch at the beginning and drifted away. And that is a recapturable group, I think, because they did enjoy Overwatch, and they're probably going to be excited about these announcements and interested in trying the game again with Overwatch 2 being released. So the hype factor and the changes are likely to draw some of that audience back towards the game. The question then becomes, is that worth putting off some of your core audience that like the teamwork and MOBA aspects? From being in the Overwatch community for the last 5 years, my gut feeling is that more people liked the shooter aspect than the CC MOBA aspect. The Blizzard forums, Reddit communities, Twitters, stuff like that, over the years were filled much more with people disliking CC and shooting shields and not being able to get impact out of DPS than it was filled with...
Do you think adding a barrier to playing heroes like Valorant would help NER?
Thank you. I'll get to that in a moment. Yeah, I don't know. My gut feeling, though, is that this will entice people back in. I don't even understand what that was. Yeah, I personally, this seems like a move to try and recapture some of the joy of Overwatch at the beginning of the game, where the game felt very open and DPS characters were the most impactful, and it feels like it's trying to reverse time in that sense. Now, I can definitely see the argument of you simply can't capture what has been lost. You can't dial back the clock like that. It's a fool's errand. Could definitely see that being a very valid take. Okay, we'll get to these takes in a sec, though. We'll get to these takes in a sec. Give me a moment. If Overwatch 2 comes out as 5v5, you almost have to have some off-tanks be moved to the DPS role, like Zarya Hog, and balance accordingly. Well, they're not planning on doing that, but let's entertain the possibility. Maybe a role list that both DPS and tanks can pick from, some kind of flex queue. I think that would be awful. Makes perfect sense, too, because some of the off-tank players are good at DPS heroes and vice versa. Well, here's the thing. If you take the off-tank heroes and you make them DPS, you're creating a huge pool of DPS and a tiny pool of tanks, which would be terrible for meta diversity. That would be awful, because your meta diversity is mainly about the tanks that you run and the compositions that they empower. It's not about, like, if you just have a meta where you always have Reinhardt and then your DPS change around, the game's still going to feel quite stale. There's going to be differences, but it's going to feel like the core game doesn't really... The archetype of the comp doesn't change massively. I think that trying to make Zarya and Hog main tanks is a more challenging idea for the developers, but it's also more rewarding in the long term too. Being able to... I actually think that the Zarya direction they're going in seems viable as a main tank and fun to play as well. I feel like most of the time people enjoy playing Zarya because they love being able to get fully charged and just fucking melt people while being pocketed. There's also the aspect of, like, having excellent synergy with your Reinhardt and feeling clutch when you're, like, saving him and applying the perfect bubble. But the way that Zarya has the flexibility and the ability to, like, peel in a way that some of the other off-tanks, some of the other main tanks, sorry, everyone's a main tank now, some of them don't, while still being able to get, like, this huge amount of charge, that seemed good to me. So I like the direction that Zarya was going in. Hog is always an interesting one because he has to be enough of a threat so that you need to deal with him and you can't just ignore him. But if you make like his damage too large, then he's just an unkillable fucking demon in the front line, hooking and fucking everyone. The archetype of Hog is a very common archetype in other games, MOBA games as well. In fact, primarily MOBA games, as a tank. There's a lot of hook engage tanks in other games where your idea is that you're initiating team fights not by closing the gap yourself, but by hooking other people in. And you don't necessarily have to get the pick on them yourself, but the idea is that you're hooking them to close range where all of your team can fuck them up. I do think that the archetype makes sense. It's just that Hog has either been useless or broken in his history of the game. He's either just been complete shit and an ult battery, which the ult battery portion has been changed very significantly, or he's been like hooking people around corners and just one-shotting them immediately. So do they get one-shot in those games? No, they don't. And that is a really big difference, is that the hook character does not one-shot people in the other games. The hook character is the initiation, and then you're supposed to rely on the rest of your team to finish them off. That, to me, has always been a weird thing about Hog, is that he only feels fun to play when he can finish off his own kills. But he's only really balanced if you're supposed to rely on your teammates to also finish kills. I think part of that, though, is because he was an off-tank, and so you wanted to play him as like a flanker, as a pick hero, rather than a main tank. I think the Hog main tank meta that we had this playoffs was very interesting. It's like the first time that we've ever seen that, and it was, yeah, I think the last playoff meta, honestly, is the closest you'll get to 5v5 Overwatch. You guys know what I mean by that? Where you just had kind of the Hog and the Zarya brawling, like, what did the Vast call it? The bar fight composition? I think we're going to see a lot of the game trend in that direction. Not many shields, large amount of pick characters are viable, and the supports are trying to hardcore pocket a Zarya or a Hog in the front line who's trying to push forward and make space by virtue of just being bulky at the front. Whether or not you like that meta is another question. I thought it was an interesting meta because it was so different. I don't think I would have liked it if the meta stayed like that forever. I think that would have been very boring, actually. But then you still do have like a Reinhardt, a Winston that you can swap over to play more default stuff. Like, you can still try and play dive, maybe, depending on how, like, the comps you're playing against that have poke. But if you're diving as a Winston, you don't have to worry about like divas bullying you. But then you don't have your own diva to be able to support you, or your own Zarya to give you bubbles and that kind of shit. The tank conversation is so complex because they've changed so much about it.